Hello everyone. In the previous session, we discussed how to read a poem. In this session, we will make use of some of the ideas we discussed in the earlier session to read William Blake's Auguries of Innocence. So in the last session, we spoke about the importance of approaching poetry as a special use of language. We discussed why it is important to have an understanding about the background of a poet, why we need to give due weightage to the poet's choice of words, and how understanding the macro level and the micro level meaning of a text helps us appreciate what the poet is doing. We also spoke about why we need to understand a poem's theme. In this particular session, we are going to make use of the knowledge we gained to understand the poem Auguries of Innocence by William Blake. Now, William Blake is a renowned poet. In fact, he is considered to be one of the key figures of English poetry. The poems he wrote were about divinity, humanity, mysticism, nature, animal life. He was a poet who focused his attention on what it is to be human and how we are human. So you will be finding all these influences in his poetry. So when you approach reading a poem like the one that we are going to read now, it helps if you had some idea about the poet's life, his poetic style, and some of the common themes that he or she deals with. Now, before we start the poem, I would like to request you to recollect one moment of awe and one moment of great displeasure that you had. As human beings, one of the ways that we with other from differentiate ourselves from other creatures is by our ability to think and our ability to feel and our ability to communicate whatever we think and we feel. And as human beings, we have had a number of experiences that set us apart from other animals, but also set us apart from other members of our species. We have an individual experience. And I believe that all of you might have had an experience where you have looked at nature and have been filled with awe and wonder, where you look at a particular object, a particular animal, or a scenery, and you have felt, wow, this is simply beautiful. And you might have had moments where this experience would have led you to ask profound questions, or at least provided it would have provided you with a deeper appreciation of life. Now, this poem is also begins with a few lines describing what the poet himself might have experienced or what he believes humanity is capable of experiencing. So here are the first four lines of the poem. To see a world in a grain of sand and a heaven in a wild flower, hold infinity in the palm of your hand and eternity in an hour. Now, if we were to pause and look at these four lines, even before we proceed, we might not be able to understand the whole of the poem. We might not be able to receive what the poet attempts to do. Now, we will be discussing only the first half of the poem, so we will try to read the poem in a go and then maybe return to each one of these stanzas and look at what the poet is trying to communicate to us. A robin redbreast in a cage puts all heaven in a rage. A dove house filled with doves and pigeons shudders hell through all its regions. A dog starved at his master's gate predicts the ruin of the state. A horse misused upon the road calls to heaven for human blood. Each outcry of the hunted hare a fibre from the brain does tear. A skylark wounded in the wing, a cherubim does cease to sing. The gamecock clipped and armed for fight, does the rising sun affright. Every wolf's and lion's howl raises from hell a human soul. The wild deer, wandering here and there, keeps the human soul from care. The lamp, misused, breeds public strife, and yet forgives the butcher's knife. The bat that flits at close of eve has left the brain that won't believe. The owl that calls upon the night speaks the unbeliever's fright. He who shall hurt the little wren shall never be beloved by men. He who the ox to wrath has moved shall never be by women loved. The wanton boy that kills the fly shall feel the spider's enmity. He who torments the chaffer's sprite weaves a bower in endless night. The caterpillar on the leaf repeats to thee thy mother's grief. Kill not the moth nor butterfly, for the last judgment draweth nigh. So that is the whole of the poem, at least the first half of the poem. Now, in this particular part of the poem, we find that the poet begins by showcasing or telling us what humanity is capable of feeling and experiencing, and then he starts to go into a kind of a long list of complaints about how man mistreats animals and what he thinks are the consequences of our actions. Now, as I told you earlier, William Blake is someone who's very spiritual, and therefore, most of these consequences are divine judgments. So, the poem begins with this very beautiful uh, statement um, to see the whole world in a grain of sand. And then he moves on to say that, we are able to see heaven in a wild flower, and we are able to experience, we are able to hold infinity in the palm of our hand. And he finally closes this particular part of the poem by saying, we all experience eternity in an hour. And it is this humankind that is capable of all these wonderful, sublime experiences, these beautiful experiences that make us go, wow. He tells us that it is the same humanity that at times orphans the fellow creatures with whom we share our world to utter destruction. And he begins by pointing out a number of animals and how they are mistreated. So he begins by stating that the robin redbreast is in a cage, and that puts all of heaven in a rage. When doves are mistreated, he says the entire region turns to hell. A dog starved by its own master speaks about the empathy that men tend to have towards their own fellow human beings. So he says that when animals are mistreated, it is a reflection of how we treat one another. So he goes on this long list. It's almost kind of a reverie, a kind of a dirge song, a kind of a lamentation for what is being done to the animals. So all these animals, horses, skylarks, when they are mistreated, there is a kind of, a divine reaction. And it also speaks about our loss of humanity. So every time a hare is hunted, we lose a part of a humanity. He says a fiber in the brain, breaks down. So at the outset, it appears to be a very simple poem. So when you look at the first four lines, they are very short, they are rhythmic, they have they have a rhyme in them, but at the same time, they are speaking about something very profound. And it is this ability of the poem to translate very difficult ideas into very simple language that makes it so special. So when you look at the poem's opening lines, to see the world in a grain of sand, The poet is not asking the reader to think. He is not asking the reader to argue. He is not asking the reader to contemplate or philosophize. He's actually asking the reader to just see the world for its beauty through a grain of sand. The poem is an invitation to experience the simplicity of nature. Now, as I said earlier, the poet continues his lamentation, if one can call it that. So he talks about how gamecocks affect the way the sun rises. He talks about how wolves and lions have divine power when they howl. And he talks about how the wild deer uh, heals the human soul. And having spoken about all these different kind of animals and how mistreating them affects our humanity, he goes on to say that the most important recurring idea that is found in the poem is, of course, the idea of the last judgment or divine judgment. So whenever we mistreat animals, there are two consequences according to the poet. One is, of course, divine wrath, and the other is our loss of humanity. So on one hand, if we mistreat animals, we incur punishment from God, God punishes us, or we become less and less human. So here, for example, if somebody mistreats an ox, then that individual will never be loved by women. The same goes for those who hurt little wrens. And if you were to mistreat a dog, your society is about to break down. So there are two recurring ideas. One is when you hurt animals, you lose your humanity, and the other is you bring upon yourself divine wrath. So, having spoken so far about what at least this section of the poem deals with, I would now invite you to consider the way we treat animals in our present day society. How do you think about animals? How do you treat them? What is your opinion about killing animals for food, killing animals for clothing, or for whatever needs that arises for us? So, one of the ways to think about the poem's theme is to think about animal cruelty. That is something that the poem makes us to think about. The other thing that maybe the poet touches upon, but not in great detail, is the whole interconnection between humans, animals, and divinity. The connection between humans and animals is explored at length in the poem, as well as the interconnection between the human and the divine. So these three categories, the animal, the human, and the divine, are intricately woven in this poem. And in some sense, the poet says that how we treat animals reflects upon the way that we relate to our fellow human beings as well as to God. So, before we close this session, I would like to invite you to think about this particular statement by Ritik. He says that all sentient beings should have at least one right, the right not to be treated as property. So I would like you to think about this poem, about the different kind of images that the poem throws at us. And I would like you to think about what do you believe is the right way to treat animals? Do you believe that animals should be treated fairly? Do you believe that animals have an equal status with mankind? One of the interesting things that happen when we read poetry is that poetry and good literature always provokes us to think in a different fashion than the way that we are often used to. So this poem certainly invites us to think about animals and to think about our relationship with animals differently. Thank you.